Welcome to the West Chicago City Museum's 31st Tales Tombstones Tell. Although we all wish we were in a candlelit cemetery tonight, honoring the West Chicagoans who have gone before us, we are still happy to bring this program to you virtually. The City Museum staff created Tales Tombstones Tell in 1990 to bring the rich history of our community to life through the variety of life stories of those who have called West Chicago home. Over the past few years, the museum has not just presented the stories of those buried in Oakwood Cemetery, our community's oldest cemetery and the birthplace of this program, but also held cemetery walks at Glen Oak and Calvary cemeteries. Telling the stories of those who came before us is vital to learn about the changes and history that has helped shape our community, as well as our nation. As today we are truly living through historic times, history has never been more important to help teach us and also connect us to our ancestors and our neighbors. This year's Tales Tombstones Tell focuses on the women of West Chicago. 2020 marks the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, which gave women the right to vote. As a female alderman representing my community in local government, I join this commemoration year and thank those women who fought hard to ensure we had the full benefits of our citizenship at the ballot box. In this program, you will hear references to Junction, Turner, and Turner Junction. Our town was originally founded as the town of Junction and then the town of Turner, but was informally known as Turner Junction until our official name change in 1896 to West Chicago. The leaders of our town at that time thought this name was more metropolitan and would attract industry and residents. In many ways, their decision paid off, but it also caused some confusion that we still deal with today. West Chicago, which is 30 miles west of Chicago, was founded as a railroad town in 1849. The railroad industry attracted Irish, English, and German immigrants, who became integral in the development of our town. German immigrants created the first bilingual community in West Chicago, centered around today's St. Michael's Church on West Washington Street. By 1910, immigrants from around the world came to work on the railroad and live in the boxcar camps. By 1920, Mexican workers and their families were the majority of those living in the boxcar camp on the west side of town. As Mexican immigrants continued to settle in West Chicago, the second bilingual community was naturally created. Today, our Latinx community accounts for over half of our population. But West Chicago is truly reflective of a multi-ethnic modern town. The diversity in our community can be seen in the stories you will hear in this program and the women that helped shape West Chicago. We hope you enjoy hearing about the women who fought for their families, their town, their health, and paved their own way through history.
Many communities speak of a founding father or founding family. West Chicago is no different, but we also have a founding mother, Mary Thompson McConnell. Mary never had any children of her own, but helped shape the foundational institutions of early West Chicago alongside her husband. Our town was formed from two early land plats created in 1851 and 1857. The town of Junction, where the rail lines meet on what is now Washington Street, was platted first by John B. Turner, a railroad executive who was the driving force for the railroads coming west out of Chicago to this very spot, and which would shape the community up through the present day. The town of Turner was platted by Dr. Joseph and Mary McConnell, who named their plat in honor of John Turner. Our city's early land area was formed from the two plats and was informally referred to as Turner Junction. The heart of the growing community was shaped by the McConnells, and although many history books credit Dr. Joseph McConnell, we are happy to shed some light on his wife Mary, who we know supported and worked alongside him in community building. Mary was born in 1808 and grew up in South Central New York. Her mother died shortly after her sister was born, most likely due to complications of childbirth, when Mary was just 2 years old. Her father, a prosperous farmer, remarried, and as the oldest child of 12, Mary helped her stepmother raise her siblings. Mary married William Fuller in 1840, but was widowed just 2 years later, at the age of 33, with no children. Mary may have found herself entering her midlife alone, but she was well educated and managed her financial matters and land independently. She was able to buy out her deceased husband's relatives and stay on her marital farm in Yates County, New York, where she made a life for herself for over 10 years. In 1853, she met and married Dr. Joseph McConnell from neighboring Elmira, New York. Joseph had never married previously, having spent much of his life dealing with illnesses. Within a year of their marriage, the couple headed west to DuPage County after a falling out with Joseph's family. In 1854, the couple purchased a large tract of land just north of the new railroad junction from a farmer who had decided to move on to Iowa. Mary was the person named on the purchase deed. She benefited from a recently passed law allowing married women to hold land. Mary was one of the first women to be able to own land outright in the area. Mary and Joseph had a busy civic life here in Turner Junction. With their land purchase, they platted the town of Turner in 1857 and began dividing the land up for other settlers. They recognized the importance of creating space for community institutions to grow, donating the land for Oakwood Cemetery and St. Michael's Catholic Church, which in those early days of the settlement stood on the edge of town. Mary and Joseph were active in the First Congregational Church, located near their home on East Washington Street. They also named the streets in the community, including naming Sophia Street just off of Washington for Mary's sister. Sophia, at 16 years younger than Mary, was most likely the closest Mary ever got to having a daughter of her own, and lived with Mary in Turner for many years before returning to New York. Despite being busy, Mary made time to stay in contact with her family out east. After her sister Nancy lost her oldest son at Andersonville Prison during the Civil War, and then tragically also lost her husband, Mary invited Nancy and her remaining son, James Thompson Hosford, to come live with her and Joseph. James established himself here in the community and married Caroline West, who was part of the family that lived next door to the McConnells. Joseph McConnell died just 5 days after his nephew's wedding on November 7, 1877. Mary, now a widow, lived with the newlyweds for the next 13 years until her death. When James and Caroline welcomed their first daughter, they named her after Mary, a tribute to their caring aunt. James Hosford was the executor of his aunt Mary McConnell's estate. Recently, the museum has discovered that he was supposed to erect a monument at Oakwood Cemetery for Joseph and Mary, but he never did. Plans for a joint family monument were proposed by the Hosfords and the Wests, who are also buried there, but that never happened either. We are not sure why this monument was never erected, But Joseph and Mary McConnell gave much of themselves to this community and to the founding of the cemetery. We hope that one day a stone can be erected in tribute to them and their contributions.
Anne Ward. Anne Barber Ward and her husband David Ward were natives of Rothwell, England, emigrating to Turner in 1849. David was born in 1826, and like his father, he worked in a coal mine. The Rothwell Colliery, or coal mine, was a deep pit mine. There had been mining in the area for over 600 years. In fact, the Rothwell Colliery remained an operating mine until 1983. It wasn't until 1842 that an act of Parliament decreed that women and girls, or boys under the age of 10, could not work in the mines. So beginning at the young age of 9, Dave worked a grueling job in the coal mine, continuing those 10 to 12-hour mining days until he was 22. Despite working what must have been an exhausting day, David was very determined to get an education and attended night school. David Ward had married Anne Barber, and together they saved money to emigrate, sailing from Liverpool to New York, a trip that took them 38 days. After docking in their new country, they headed directly for Winfield Township, first settling 3 miles southeast of Gary's Mill, just south of present-day West Chicago. David and Anne first purchased a 60-acre farm, and within a few years were able to move to a larger 130-acre farm to the east of the growing settlement of Turner Junction. Anne and David raised a family of 9 children, losing only one daughter to childhood disease. The Ward's second farm was about 1.5 miles east of here in the area now known as High Lake. High Lake was the central landmark of the Ward property, so named because of its 300-foot elevation above Lake Michigan. The 5-acre spring-fed lake and surrounding oak woods were a favorite community picnic site for 4th of July celebrations in the 1880s and 1890s. In summer, the lake was the old swimming hole, and in winter, ice was cut to be stored in local ice houses. While in their 70s, David and Anne retired from the farm and moved into town. Anne, a West Chicago sturdy pioneer, died in 1903. Her obituary spoke of her generosity and thoughtfulness, her devotion to her neighbors, and her tenderness as a mother. She was buried in Oakwood Cemetery. After Anne's death, her husband sold part of the farm in 1908 to the Aurora, Elgin, and Chicago Railroad. This new railroad was a streetcar line from Chicago into the suburbs. 2 years later, the remainder of the Ward farm and the neighboring Steffi's farm were sold to a developer. Billed as a new suburban community, High Lake offered country living with city accessibility. The AE&C Railroad commissioned a song, High Lake, Where the Birds Sing, in order to promote the area. A clubhouse was built at the lakeshore, becoming a center for community activities. Coincidentally, the day that High Lake was formally opened in 1911 was the day David Ward died. Their children stayed in the area, and son Charles owned the Ward Lumber Company, which stood where the West Chicago Public Library stands today.
Carrie Roundy was born in Turner in March of 1857, the same year Mary McConnell and her husband Joseph filed the town plat for Turner. Carrie's parents, Maria Kimball and Gordon Roundy, came to this area in the 1830s and moved to Winfield Township from Wayne in 1843. Here they raised Carrie, along with her 11 siblings, sadly 5 died in infancy, on the 120-acre family farm on the northeastern corner of Prince Crossing and Geneva Roads, where St. Andrew's Lutheran Church is located today. Carrie's maternal grandfather, Reverend William Kimball, was a Methodist minister who preached from the first log cabin that he built for his family in Wayne. Settlers in this area would travel 5 to 6 miles to hear him preach in the crowded cabin. He also constructed an early school to ensure that the pioneer children received an education, something Carrie's mother passed along, instilling the importance of education in Carrie and her siblings. With the family traditions in mind, Carrie became a teacher after graduating from Northside School, but she was remembered as a lifelong learner, continuing in post-secondary education for 14 years. When Carrie started her teaching career, her family had moved into Turner, renting out the family farm. Carrie, however, found her first teaching job in Caneville, in Kane County, before returning to West Chicago to teach. After 6 years of teaching, Carrie faced a health crisis and she took a year off. She always dreamed of teaching abroad in Japan, but due to her health concerns when she recovered, she stayed close to home and taught in the West Chicago elementary schools, where she spent the rest of her career. When Carrie was 35, her mother passed away unexpectedly. Unlike many other women in the 1890s, Carrie's mother's death did not go unnoticed, and her obituary shows the importance she and the Roundy family played in the community. A line from her obituary read, quote, "Mrs. Roundy was a faithful, kind and appreciative wife, an ideal mother, and a true friend. She was a woman of strong mental powers, clear insight, and splendid executive ability," unquote. Praising a woman, particularly a wife and a mother, for her intellectual abilities was unusual for this time period. As any mother knows today, you do need splendid executive ability to manage a family, especially one with 7 children. Maria was a strong woman, produced strong and abled daughters. Carrie, no doubt, inspired by her mother, took her own mission to mother and educate the children of Turner, working as a grammar school local teacher for 51 years. At the age of 62, she became the first principal of Lincoln School when it opened in 1921. Carrie never married, so she really put her life's work into her career. Carrie's sisters also showed their determination as women to make their own way in Turner. Her sister Kate was also a teacher and was described as a, quote, "lady of unusual ability," unquote. Another sister, Jane, served for almost 50 years as the Winfield Township treasurer. These Roundy women were a force to be reckoned with. A building designed for kindergartners was built near the former Methodist Church at Wood and Church Streets and was named after Carrie to honor her for her dedication to community education. Carrie Roundy School opened in 1952, 8 years after Carrie passed away, educating youngsters for 27 years in Carrie's honor.
Mary Kaesser. The stories of local women feature many issues women have had to face over history. The story of Mary Kaesser highlights a health struggle Mary was not alone in facing. Women's health care has often lagged behind men's. Just as through history, women were given fewer options and choices in their lives, their health care and rights were also limited. Today, mental health is a hot topic and one that often does not receive as much attention as it should. In our modern age of medicine, mental health disorders are still misunderstood, but in the 19th century and early 20th century, little was known about the causes of mental illness, and those suffering from disorders were often removed from society. Mary Kaesser was one such woman who was locked away due to a mental health issue, as many women of the day were. Mary's parents, George Lewis and Emma, had immigrated to the area from Germany in the mid-1800s. At that time, many German immigrants were settling in western DuPage County. Mary was born in 1864, and when she was 14 years old, her father passed away at the early age of 47. Her father's death left her mother to care for 4 young children alone. no easy task for a woman at that time. The 1880 census records shows us that Mary was still attending school at the age of 16, even though her 14-year-old brother Frederick was working as a farmhand, no doubt to help out the family with bills. Soon after that record was made, though, life changed radically for Mary. In 1886, the newspaper reported that she had died at Elgin and labeled her as an insane daughter. In the late 19th century, Illinois had 11 charitable institutions that were home to those suffering from mental disorders. One of these institutions was the Northern Illinois Mental Hospital and Asylum for the Insane in Elgin. And at some point following 1880, Mary was hospitalized there. The Elgin Insane Hospital was a horrible place, where the criminally insane and often violent individuals were sent. The Elgin institution was also a place where many poor people were sent in the area. Within 14 years of it opening, newspapers reported that the hospital was overcrowded with patients with no adequate means of their care or comfort. The conditions of which Mary was exposed to before her death are unimaginable. We are not sure why Mary was even sent to the hospital or how she died, but it's hard to imagine that she received any quality treatment in the overcrowded and poorly ran hospital. In 1909, the institution was renamed the Elgin Mental Hospital, removing the negative association with the prior term insane. The hospital was finally closed in 1960 and was torn down in 1974. Today, the Elgin site is known as one of the most haunted places in Illinois, no doubt due to the horrors poor people dealing with mental health issues experienced at that hospital. The historic pandemic that we are living through right now has thankfully helped us further understand how important mental health can be. Sadly for Mary, her time in history offered her few options for care.
Catherine Alice Kelley Carey. Our journey tonight now takes us to Calvary Cemetery, the Catholic cemetery here in West Chicago. Catherine Alice Kelley Carey was an Irish American who was known to most people as Katie. For hundreds of years, Ireland had an agriculture-based economy, and when the potato was introduced in the 1600s, it quickly became a major food source. When a fungus wiped out most of the crops in the 1840s, many farmers throughout Ireland were forced into harsh poverty. More than 1 million Irish left the island, emigrating to the United States and Canada. The Irish faced discrimination here in many of the larger cities they came to. Irish were stereotyped as drunks and fighters, and they were disliked because many feared the fact that the Irish were Catholic with their large families would overpopulate some areas. Katie's parents, John Kelley and Catherine MacDonald, were both born in Ireland and came to the United States sometime before their marriage on January 26, 1859 in Kane County. The couple settled in what was then Turner Junction and started a family. Jobs were plentiful throughout the town, particularly in the railroad, where John found work in the train yards. He was a train car inspector. As many Irish were bitter from the plight of the potato famine, they chose not to farm the rich Midwestern land and took jobs in industry.
From the 1850s through the 1870s, Irish immigrants made up the largest number of foreign-born residents living in town. Today, we have found no evidence of discrimination against the Irish here in this area. Another likely reason that many made it to West Chicago. Born in August of 1872, Katie was one of 8 children born to her parents. However, one of her brothers died shortly after birth, a sad but not uncommon occurrence in those days. As they grew older, Katie and her siblings remained in her parents' home, making lives for themselves here in Turner Junction. Her brother, George, followed in their father's footsteps and began working for the railroad, eventually earning the position of a locomotive engineer. Her sister Anna worked as a local school teacher, while her brother John worked in a local tin shop. Well, we're not really sure if Katie worked prior to her marriage, but as she didn't marry until she was 24, it is highly likely that she did. On October 21st, 1896, she married Edward Carey, who was also an Irish immigrant, and together they founded their home in West Chicago. Edward was 12 years her senior, and at the age of 36, also a rather old age to finally be getting married. Like most of the Irish immigrants and their descendants in town, Edward Carey worked on the railroad. He became a train conductor. Katie and Edward lived on North Street. Today, that's Washington Street, along with Edward's father, Edward Sr. The couple had 2 children, one of which died at birth. Tragically, Katie passed away 2 years after the birth of her daughter, Ruth Ann, in 1912. 4 years after Katie's passing, Edward remarried Lucy Coyle. He lived until he was 86 years old, and after 34 years apart, he and Katie were reunited in burial here at Cavalry Cemetery.
Emeteria Zarate came to West Chicago in the 1920s with her husband, Jacob, and their 4 children. Born and raised in San Luis Potosí, Mexico, her husband, Jacob, first immigrated to Louisiana to work in 1922 and brought Emeteria and their oldest son, Leon, the next year. The couple had a second son, Modesto, known as Mo, in 1924, while still living in Louisiana. The young family came to West Chicago so that Jacob could work in the growing Chicago and Northwestern Railroad crew that worked and lived in the west side of West Chicago in the boxcar camp. During their early years in the boxcar camp, the family added 2 daughters, Jane and Catherine. Raising her family in the boxcar camp was not easy. Their homes were made out of boxcars that had the wheels removed and were set onto the earth as homes. The boxcars were hot in the summer. In the winter, the cracks were plugged with rags to block the snow. Each had a potbelly stove and a cooking stove. An annual ration of coal never lasted the season, so more were scavenged. From salvaged lumber, wire, and nails, the family built a chicken coop and a pig house to help provide the family an extra source of food. An outside pump supplied their water. The Zarates had 2 boxcars, one for the women of the family and one for the men. By the 1930s, Emeteria and Jacob wanted to ensure that their children got a good education,
So Jacob switched jobs and began working for the Elgin, Joliet, and Eastern Railroad. This meant that they moved to the boxcar camp closer to town at the west end of Grand Lake Boulevard. Now the children would be closer to St. Mary's School. The Zarate children were among the first Mexican students to graduate from St. Mary's, and with many thanks to Emeteria, who sold produce from their family garden to make tuition payments for their schooling. While Jacob worked in the railroad, Emeteria helped to support the family with food from her large garden, where she raised corn, beans, lettuce, cucumbers, potatoes, chili peppers, and tomatoes. Emeteria boiled dried field corn they grew with lime, and dried and ground it for tortillas, a common practice in Mexican kitchens of those days. Emeteria also grew flour around their boxcars and sold them to railroad engineers for their wives. Her flowers and garden produce were also sold by the family at Chicago's Water Street Market. By 1940, the Zarates had electricity in their boxcar home. With savings, they bought a radio and their first car, a 1928 Chevy. Jacob took orders from neighbors and shopped at Mexican grocery stores along Halsted Street in Chicago on Sundays to bring back to the other Mexican immigrants living in the boxcar camps. In 1945, the Elgin Joliet and Eastern Railroad closed the boxcar camps, and Jacob Zarate went back to work for the Chicago and Northwest Railroad. Emeteria, who ably managed the family's finances, had saved $2,000 as down payment for their first home on Stimmel Street. Jane, her daughter, lived in the home until just a few years ago. Emeteria passed away in 1994 at the age of 91. She was laid to rest next to Jacob at Calvary Cemetery.
Zelda DeTray, this was her name. She was born in Quincy, Illinois on July 6 in 1895. Her parents' names were Floyd and Mary DeTray, and they moved quite a bit in the first years of her life. First, they moved to Chicago, then they moved to Ohio. This is where her dad, Floyd, was from. But then they moved back to the Chicagoland area. Eventually, they settled the DeTray family in Aurora, Illinois. And this was by the time Zelda was in grade school. Zelda graduated from West Aurora High School in 1914 before the family relocated again. This time, they moved to West Chicago. This was in 1918, the year of the flu pandemic. And they stayed here. In West Chicago, her dad worked for the Union Tool Company before he opened the DeTray lock nut factory. This factory was positioned right along the rail line, which was also near the family home that was at 187 West Grand Lake Boulevard. Floyd marketed his unique lock, nut, and washer combo as both an economical and efficient solution, and it was quite successful. So her dad actually held patents for many of his inventions, which allowed the family to live really well for the time and for Zelda to be able to pursue her passion in the arts, something that is still hard to do to this day. Zelda took up photography while the DeTray family was still living in Aurora at something called the Aurora Studio. And when they moved to West Chicago, she opened up her own studio in their home on West Grand Lake. And for more than 20 years, she did portraits of local people and she photographed local events. I should also add that Zelda was a true lover of all the arts because she studied dramatic arts at the James School of Expression in Aurora, and she also took up oil and watercolor painting. And this last skill came in really useful because she would hand color her own photographs, And, otherwise they would have remained black and white, because these were the days of black and white photography. Most 20th century black and white photography are something called gelatin silver prints. And this is, the image actually is made up from silver metal particles that's suspended in gelatin on, like a layer on a piece of paper. So if you wanted color, you would have to color them in yourself. So the skill of knowing how to paint, would come in really handy there. Zelda did not only want to learn all these different art forms, but she also wanted to pass them on to others. And she would give private lessons and open, hold open classes for both adults and children. And she also started the DeTray Dramatic School, which presented plays by and for children. So it is said that Zelda gained some of her artistic talents and love for the arts from her father's side of the family. And they were direct descendants of this old noble d'Estrées family of Paris in France. At the age of 60, Zelda got married to George W. Dunbar. He was a widower with 2 daughters. They were married at St. Michael's Church here on West Washington Street in West Chicago in 1957. And it was said that it was a very fashionable wedding for the times. The newspaper reported that Zelda wore a ballerina length gown. Her pink nylon shoulder length veil was held in place by a floral coronet matching the blooms in her white colonial bouquet. So the couple went on a honeymoon trip, and they went to Niagara Falls, New York City, and Washington, D.C. Her husband, George, he worked for the Chicago and Northwestern, and I would say that he was a very prominent and active citizen of West Chicago. But sadly, their marriage didn't happen very long, because George passed away on June 3rd in 1962, already after a brief illness. So Zelda was actually widowed after just 5 years of marriage. In her later years, Zelda spent time doing the things that she loved to do the most. And this was portraying the beauty of nature on canvas, so painting. And she just loved the outdoors so much, and she also wanted others to enjoy it. So, enjoying it through her artwork. And she exhibited her paintings for several years right here in West Chicago at the West Chicago Public Library mostly during the West Chicago Women's Club Annual Art Show. Zelda passed away on October 26, 1978, and she was laid to rest at the Glen Oaks Cemetery.
Thank you for joining us for our 31st Tales Tombstones Tell. We truly hope that next year we will all be together back in the cemeteries of West Chicago, telling the stories of those who came before us. If you have any questions about any of the presentations we had tonight, or any other West Chicago descendants, please reach out to us at wegohistory@gmail.com or 630-231-3376. A huge thank you to all of our readers for lending their voices to tonight's presentation and for all the work that they do in our West Chicago community. We hope that you and your family are well, and we look forward to seeing you soon. Thank you.